It's an honor and a privilege to be here at the CAP Ideas Conference, and certainly thankful to Neera Tandem for her tremendous leadership. She's a voice for the voiceless and a defender of the disenfranchised and an all-around force of nature on behalf of the progressive causes that we all hold dear. I want to thank each and every one of you for your tremendous involvement over the last few years, in particular in helping to turn things around, or begin the process, of course, of turning things around here in this great country. It's my understanding that after I speak, Adam Schiff is next, and so I'm really just his warm-up act. And so I've decided that I'm going to follow what has often been referred to as the B rule of public speaking. The B rule of public speaking: be brief, be bright, and be gone. But I do want to share a few thoughts about the House Democratic agenda, and I'm so privileged and honored to have the opportunity to serve as the chair of the House Democratic caucus, position that I assume responsibility for at the beginning of this Congress. My first act as chair of the House Democratic caucus, in fact, it was my responsibility to place the name of Nancy Pelosi in nomination as our next speaker. And isn't she doing a great job? She's doing a great job. Donald Trump has no idea what to do with her. I mean, he can't even come up with a nickname. He just calls her Nancy. She's doing a tremendous job, and we're so proud of her. My first responsibility was to place her name in nomination. And so a few days before that, I was in my living room thinking through my remarks, and my youngest son, Joshua, who's 14, came up to me and said, "Dad, what are you doing?" I said, "Well, you know, as the incoming chair of the House Democratic caucus, it's my responsibility to nominate Nancy Pelosi. She's going to be our next speaker on January 3rd. Do you have any advice for your father?" And without missing a beat, he said, "Dad, don't blow the moment." And I just really want to say that we recognize as House Democrats that this is a critical moment. And we have a responsibility both to deliver on the kitchen table pocketbook issues that we talk to the American people about in advance of the midterm election, with a focus on lowering health care costs and increasing pay for everyday Americans. But we also recognize, of course, and Adam will talk about this, that we have a responsibility as a separate and co-equal branch of government. We don't work for Donald Trump, we work for the American people. And we have a constitutional responsibility to serve as a check and balance on an out-of-control executive branch. We will never bend the knee to Donald J. Trump, the first of his name. This is a democracy, and we recognize the moment that we are in. The beautiful thing about the House Democratic caucus is that we are the most diverse legislative caucus in the history of the Republic. Democrat, Republican, 20th century, 21st century, House, Senate, the most diverse legislative caucus in the history of the Republic. More women serving in the House than ever before, over 100. More African Americans, more Latinos, more Native Americans, more members of the LGBT community. So we authentically represent the American people. And we, as a House Democratic caucus, recognize that diversity is a strength. It is not a weakness. We are a nation of immigrants, some voluntary, others involuntary. But as Dr. King once observed, we may have come over on different ships, but we're all in the same boat now. We are a gorgeous mosaic of people from across the world. We are white, we are black, we are Latino, we are Asian, we are Native American. We are Christian, we are Jewish, we are Muslim, we are Hindu, we are gay, we are straight, we are young, we are older, we are women, we are men, we are citizens, we are dreamers. Out of many, we are one. That's what makes America a great country. And no matter what xenophobic behavior is coming out of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, we're not going to let anyone take that away from us, not now, not ever. And so we're proceeding with an understanding of our values and our diversity and our unity, which makes us strong. Understanding that these are very challenging times. We want to move the country forward. They want to turn back the clock. We want to bring people together. They are trying to tear us apart. We're fighting for the people. They're fighting for the privileged few. We're trying to stand up for the least, the lost, and the left behind. They're standing up for the wealthy, the well-off, and the well-connected. We believe in the public interest. They're all about the special interest. We want to protect Social Security and Medicare. They're trying to take it away. We believe in unions and the right to collectively bargain. They want to destroy our freedom to negotiate. The stakes are incredibly high. But we're proceeding anchored in our values, understanding that we believe in a country that provides for the poor, works for working families, makes sense for the middle class, and stands up for senior citizens. We believe in a country with liberty and justice for all, equal protection under the law, government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And so we clearly have laid out our for the people agenda. And in connection with that, we have made clear to the American people that we are going to fight and work hard to lower health care costs, protect people with pre-existing conditions, deal with the high cost of life-saving prescription drugs, strengthen the Affordable Care Act, increase pay for everyday Americans, enact the real infrastructure plan, defend the dreamers, clean up corruption, address the climate crisis, deal with the gun violence epidemic, and end the era of voter suppression once and for all. That is the House Democratic for the People agenda. And we've already begun to do a lot in that regard. In the first 100 or so days, we passed H.R. 8, comprehensive universal criminal background check legislation. We passed the Paycheck Fairness Act because we believe in equal pay for equal work. We passed the Equality Act because we believe that love does not discriminate based on gender identity and neither, or sexual orientation, and neither should the law. And of course, we've worked to lower health care costs and protect people with pre-existing conditions in the face of an onslaught from this administration. What is clear is that this administration wants to take away health care from tens of millions of Americans. We're not going to let that happen. This administration wants to impose an age tax on people between 50 and 64 because that is what will happen if you take away the Affordable Care Act, and that will dramatically increase premiums, co-pays, and deductibles for those Americans. We're not going to let that happen. This administration wants to take away protections for pre-existing conditions that would impact more than 100 million Americans, perhaps one of the most significant accomplishments of the Affordable Care Act. And we're going to stand to defend that. In many ways, we believe that is what the 2018 midterm election was about. We recognize as House Democrats that there are millions of Americans who are battling cancer. That's a pre-existing condition. There are millions of Americans struggling through heart disease. That's a pre-existing condition. Millions of Americans, including children in neighborhoods like those I represent and others all across the country, particularly in low-income communities, dealing with asthma, in part because of the impact of environmental racism. That's a pre-existing condition. Over 10 million Americans struggling through an opioid addiction. That's a pre-existing condition. And more than 100 million Americans have either diabetes or pre-diabetes. That is a pre-existing condition. The stakes are incredibly high, and we understand the moment that we're in. We also have made clear to the American people that in addition to strengthening the Affordable Care Act, we want to drive down the high cost of life-saving prescription drugs, because there is no reason in the world that here in America we should pay more for life-saving medication than any other nation in the world. It is a direct result of the special interest power of Big Pharma in this town, and we are determined to break it. And we believe that in order to do that, there are several things that we are working on, and I'll only outline a small few. We believe that Medicare should have the ability to use its bulk price purchasing power to negotiate lower drug prices for the American people. And we are determined to make that happen. Medicaid has the ability. The Veterans Administration has the ability. There is no reason in the world while Medicare shouldn't have that ability. It would result in lower drug prices for tens of millions of Americans. We will not rest until that occurs. We also want to break up the racket that exists in so many ways between the brand name companies and their desire to maintain monopolistic type control over the pricing that the American people pay. The FDA has said that brand name drugs and generic drugs have the same therapeutic medicinal impact. The same impact. But over time, generic drugs cost 80 to 85% less than their brand name counterparts. And that's the reason why we want to break up the monopolistic racket in a few different ways. One of them is outlawing the practice that's known as pay for delay. That when the brand name drug is about to come off patent, there have been pharmaceutical companies who will actually pay the generic companies not to put the generic drugs on the market in order to delay the onset of competition that will result in lower drug prices for the American people. We in the House Judiciary Committee and the Energy and Commerce Committee have already passed legislation that would make the pay-for-delay practice illegal under law, and we are determined to get it through the House and outlaw this outrageous practice. We also are dealing with something called citizen petition abuse. Under the current law, the FDA has a mechanism by which when a brand name drug is getting ready to come off patent, anybody in America can file a petition with the FDA to express concerns about the soon coming availability of the generic drugs. But what we've learned is that while citizens may or may not be filing petitions, and that is their right, the pharmaceutical companies have actually been stepping in and filing petitions to stop the availability of the generic drugs. Baseless, sham petitions that are ultimately dismissed by the FDA but delay the availability of generic drugs by months or sometimes years, costing the American consumer hundreds of millions of dollars in lost savings. We are determined to break the back of Big Pharma and dramatically lower the high cost of life-saving prescription drugs. And so we're proceeding essentially along three principles: that we believe that America, the wealthiest country in the history of the world, that no one should ever have to choose between putting food on the table, paying the rent, or getting access to the life-saving medication that they need in order to live their life with the dignity and grace that they deserve. We believe that in America, the wealthiest country in the history of the world, that health care is not simply a privilege, it is a right. And we want to bring that right into reality for every single American. And we believe that in the wealthiest country in the history of the world, every single American should have access to high-quality, life-saving, affordable health care, and that is a position that is shared by every single one of the 239 Democrats in the House of Representatives, and we're going to make sure that that principle becomes the law of the land. And in closing, let me simply say, some have said, well, that's an ambitious agenda. You're dealing with an obstinate Senate, the Grim Reaper, self-described, over on the other side of the Capitol, and a president who, of course, is out of control. How do you expect that we can bring all this into fruition? And some of those ideas we hope to enact during the 116th Congress. Others, we will lay a foundation and be able to move them forward. But ultimately, I'm confident that we will succeed. Let me quote the words of our great president, Barack Obama. Some of y'all were getting nervous on me. Our great president, Barack Obama, when he said, yes, we can, Democrats can be successful because we've always gotten things done on behalf of the American people. Democrats are the party that gave this country Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, Head Start, a living wage, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act, the Lilly Ledbetter Act, the Fair Sentencing Act, the Affordable Care Act. Democrats and Barack Obama saved our economy. Democrats saved the automobile industry, and together, Democrats will save our democracy. God bless you. God bless Cap. God bless the United States of America.
Thank you, Congressman Jeffries. There's such an expansive agenda, and I want to thank you for your remarks on healthcare. I really wanted to just ask a question or two about some other elements on issues that have been very divisive on the past. A good example is the House passed legislation that promotes re-entering the Paris Accords. Climate was an issue that previously has created divisions, have seen regional differences in the caucus, or actually in the country. Could you talk a little bit about what it was like to pass that bill and how united the caucus was doing in that, and how do you see that issue as a front line on the issue of climate?
Well, thank you for the question, and that was an important first step and a foundation for what I expect that we will continue to do to address the climate crisis that we face here in the country and, of course, throughout the world. In our first legislative act on day one, we enacted a rules package that included as a feature the constitution of a select committee on the climate crisis that the Speaker indicated would be a focus on how we move forward, led by Kathy Castor from Florida. The first piece of legislation in that regard was legislation that would express a resolution of disapproval in connection with the effort to exit the Paris Climate Accord, and we're going to pursue legislative and appropriations remedies designed to prohibit the use of funds to do anything other than make sure we keep our commitments in that regard, and explore the other legislative options that we can do in a bold fashion to confront the enormity of the problem. Under the legislative mandate, the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis has to report back to the Energy and Commerce Committee on its recommendations for legislative proposals by early next year. Their work could come in sooner than that, but we want to hear from a wide variety of stakeholders on the thoughts that people have as to how we can proceed boldly and aggressively.
Great, and one last question I wanted to ask on another issue that people have seen as divisive in the past, but had a pretty significant victory in the House, was background checks and gun safety legislation. And can you talk a little bit about how much of that, why that was a priority, and how you see that playing out in the future?
Yeah, this is an incredibly important distinction between the last time Democrats were in the majority, and I wasn't in the Congress at the time, in the current moment. There was a decision in the prior majority not to address the issue of gun violence in a comprehensive way, in part because many of the members of that new Democratic majority came from rural states and districts where those members felt at least they could not address this issue. Things have changed significantly, and every member of the House Democratic Caucus is of the view that we have to do something meaningful to deal with the gun violence epidemic. We started with universal criminal background check legislation. It did receive some Republican support on the floor of the House of Representatives. We know that the overwhelming majority of gun owners and NRA members support the notion that no individual, particularly one where there's reason to believe could do harm to others, should be able to access a gun without background checks. And so we're going to continue to aggressively push that and other issues forward and keep the pressure on the Senate so that Mitch McConnell either does his job and allows these bills to come to a vote, or we vote them all out of office and we have a new Senate majority in 2020.